missing one council? There it is. Okay. All right. I'm going to call this meeting to order. Please join us in the flag salute.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, roll call, please.
Please note for the record that all council members are present.
Okay, adoption of the agenda.
So moved.
I'll second.
Motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Council, anything to report out from closed session?
Nothing to report out, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, under old business, council will recommence its deliberations concerning the Brisbane Baylands planning applications, Baylands concept plans, Brisbane Baylands specific plan case SP-01-06, general plan amendment cases GP-01-06 and GP-01-10, and related final environmental impact report. So I think Council's going to take us to the last few months of history to see how we got here today. So, Tom, you're up.
Good evening. Tom McMorrow with Matt Phillips and Phillips, outside counsel for Brisbane on behalf of legislative matters. We've been asked to discuss how the process is played out. For many of you, you've noticed on the website that the council has put up the legislation that came out that in draft form that was essentially a threat to the city in terms of how to operate, how to build on the Baylands, as well as some other questions that have come up about whether there was draft legislation and what did it mean and what's the process been. So the council asked me tonight to prepare a somewhat detailed history of how this process has played out. So while keeping in mind that there is a legislative process privilege that I have to honor relative to the legislators, we have gone pretty far in describing the detail, and please bear with me. It's 4 pages long. At the beginning of 2017, the legislature had an unprecedented number of bills that were introduced regarding housing policy, truly unprecedented. Most of the bills were intended to help address the state's housing access and affordability crisis. As you may all recall, there was also a lot of parallel media talking about a crisis that a lot of people, not in Brisbane, but a lot of people statewide did not realize existed. So there was an intense focus on it. The Speaker of the State Assembly, Anthony Rendon from Los Angeles, said it was a top priority for the Assembly to address housing affordability and access in 2017. That was the first time that they had done that. The Senate President at the time, Kevin De Leon, announced that housing was also a top priority for the Senate in 2017. I believe it was yesterday, but earlier this week, Senator Atkins from San Diego is now the president of the state Senate. She has also said that housing remains a priority, and last year she was one of the ones who backed it. Governor Brown joined the legislative leadership in prioritizing housing development and affordability in May and June of 2017 in negotiations about the 2017-2018 state budget. In doing so, that meant that you had the 3 people, given the legislative supermajorities of the Democrats, you had the 3 people with the votes and the power to actually adopt policy changes by keeping their caucus together, and we'll get to it, but they were able to do that. One of the agreements as part of the budget that was adopted by the legislature in 2017-18, which was in June, was that the governor agreed that he would sign a package of legislation on housing policy to help address affordability and access before year end, and that some of those bills would deal with funding and they would try to put those in place immediately, which requires a 2/3 vote and then the governor's signature. So both houses voting 2/3 and the governor's signature. And in fact, they did that. We'll come back to it. At the time of the June statements by the governor, there were 3 to 4 bills being discussed publicly as part of a housing package. By September, when they were voting on it, there were 15 bills that were part of the housing package that the legislature was putting forward. These include everything from SB 35 that you have all read about or can easily read about if you would like, that take away local control in certain situations. But they also include things like the housing bond that had received widespread attention even before the session began. All 15 of the bills were enacted into law, many of them with the 2/3 vote in both houses, and therefore were able to take effect immediately. I'm sorry. Turned the page too early. I apologize. A number of the measures that were in the package, a number of the measures that were introduced in the legislature but were not in the package dealt with limiting local control. I mentioned SB 35, but there were a series of bills that also went, perhaps not as far as SB 35, but dealt with local control. They were not part of the 2017 package. Instead, what was stated publicly by the leadership on a uniform basis was that they would revisit these bills, limiting local control, in 2018. You may all recall that the headlines and the columnists were writing that the housing crisis was a result of local government standing in the way of housing. It was all local government's fault, et cetera, et cetera. It was not Sacramento's fault. It wasn't the fact that we've been fortunate with job creation and all the rest. Those bills, for the most part, were put over until 2018. However, one of the proposed measures that was not put over until 2 days left in the legislative session was focused on Brisbane. It's online. You can link to it on the Brisbane website. It is a bill that is co-authored by the legislators from south of here, Senator Hill, Mr. Mullen, who are your representatives, as well as those from the Bay Area. If you take a look at that bill, you will see that that bill essentially approves the UPC plan as proposed to be approved as a state measure and put in place as the decision on the Baylands development. That was the plan. We have had people, I want to be very clear about this, we have had people say to us, oh, no, I know that bill was posturing. I know that bill was never going to pass. I know that bill was never going to be introduced. I'm glad that they know that. We were living it, and we were fighting to make sure that it was never went from a draft to being introduced. The agreement was that the bill that was being discussed would not be introduced until 2018, if at all. That was the agreement. The co-authors of the bills ultimately agreed to not introduce it, and we owe our thanks to Senator Hill and Assemblymember Mullen, your representatives, for backing that it was not a fair process to come in at the end of the day and try to jam up Brisbane on a single development. At that time, we were asked by the city staff what we would recommend. Based on the climate in Sacramento, based on the fact that it was not at all clear that this bill would get a veto, we advised that the most prudent course was don't take the risk. Put the bill over till 2018, and let's see if we can avoid it being introduced at all. People do not believe it's viable that bill could have become law. I would encourage you to read the statements of Governor Brown and the leadership, and you will see why we were concerned about not rolling the dice about letting that bill go in at the end of 2017, and why our advice was to use the educational efforts of the city to have it put over to 2018. The bill, as I mentioned, was very one-sided, the draft bill. It had no discussion of remediation standards. It had no discussion or consideration given to the fiscal impacts on the city of tripling the population to 4,400 units. It had no consideration of the city's general plan, which did not permit housing on the affected property on the Baylands, and it did not have even a requirement that the developer include inclusionary affordable housing. It was also a question for Brisbane. Does Brisbane want to engage in fighting the state of California either in litigation or in legislation, which is a very expensive process, or does Brisbane want to make a strategic decision to try to see if they could work it out between the fall of last year and the beginning of this year? And that's what the focus has been on. And that's where we are tonight. We have a general overview of a proposal that's acceptable to the legislators who were pushing approving the UPC plan via Sacramento. We talked to the council about doing everything from a full-throated fight with Sacramento to doing a very quick and dirty compromise, which is done in Sacramento all the time. It was not at all wise for the city to consider a compromise. The city rejected that very quickly. They needed time to understand exactly what was in the offing with this draft bill and what that would mean for the city. On the other hand, a full-throated fight with the legislature, and this is often misunderstood, is you can win the fight in 2017, and then the bill comes back in 2018 and you have to refight it. And then it comes back in 2019 and you have to refight it. Sometimes it comes back multiple times in the same year with different authors and you have to refight it. It's a very expensive process. Issues don't just go away because you've defeated them once, even if you've defeated them substantively. The way you get them to go away is responsible compromise. I know compromise sometimes is a bad word in the media, but in Sacramento, that's how you get issues to be managed, is that you engage in a discussion and you try to get to responsible compromise. If you can't, you then oppose the measure or support the measure, as the case may be. We were asked to advise the city how to engage with Senator Hill, who was titularly the author of the bill. If you look at the bill, it's authored by your state representative, Jerry Hill, state senator. He authored it because he is your state representative, and he wanted control over the next steps if this bill were ever to be introduced. So it was not a threat by Jerry Hill, which some of the media have portrayed it as. It was Jerry Hill saying, if this is going to go forward, I would like to have an extra level of say in it, so I will agree to author it. Mr. Mullen did the same thing. Mr. Mullen also had twins due, et cetera, so I don't want to misrepresent Mr. Mullen's engagement, but he was monitoring it very closely. Senator Hill was very active in protecting his constituents and making sure you had say in this debate. Sure enough, 2018 is coming upon us, and the question is, what are we going to do this is in the fourth quarter of 2017, what are we going to do to make sure that the Hill bill either is not introduced or it's introduced in a form that the city can live with responsibly? We were tasked with working with Senator Hill through the council, and then in parallel to the council set up a ad hoc committee, and that ad hoc committee gave full voice to Senator Hill about Brisbane's character, Brisbane's commitment to environmental cleanup on the Baylands, Brisbane's concern about the lack of attention to the history of the entire parcel, everything from Ice House Hill needing protection to exactly what oils and contaminants went into the ground in the OU1 site, which is off the landfill. The representatives, this isn't in my notes, but the representatives for Brisbane in those meetings were Ms. Davis and Mayor Conway, and I would just tell you they were quite vocal with your senator about the need to make sure that Brisbane was treated responsibly and there was environmental cleanup. In parallel, we were meeting with Senator Hill and talking about what might be viable and what wasn't. And in short, the question was rather simple. Senator Hill, if we can get to a point that is rational by both the crisis standards and based on Brisbane's character, will you block legislation that attempts to dictate state control as opposed to local control to Brisbane? And his answer was, of course, I represent Brisbane. The question is, what do you all think is responsible? I want to stress one point. I say character. By character, I simply mean most of the legislature has not come out, even the local, and seen what the Baylands is. They don't understand the distance. They don't understand the hills that are there. They don't understand the history. I'm not talking about the character of the town being political or otherwise. I'm talking about understanding where this housing would go and all the work that would have to be done, and just by fiat approving that in Sacramento and then waiting for Brisbane to challenge it in court. Had Brisbane challenged it in court, I can tell you, having fought these things, it would have been millions of dollars. And I want to stress that. It would have been millions of dollars of city funds. Wouldn't have been the League of Cities. It would have been Brisbane. Second point, the question has come up about whether or not we could just solve it. We'll referendum it. It's a state law. That means you're having the entire state of California vote on a referendum to overturn a bill that relates to a city that, to be blunt, most have never heard of. It's a small city outside of South San Francisco. They're not quite sure what it is. Why would they get involved in it? It's a multi-million-dollar proposition. So in balancing litigation costs, fighting with the legislature costs, remediation costs, and so on, the equation gets far more complex. And on the one hand, how many houses can we put there? And on the other hand, let's put nothing there except commercial space. And that's where you start looking for responsible compromise. After months of discussion, where we started at, why does there have to be development at all? Period. Not commercial, not residential. Why don't we just remediate it and then let the council at the time decide what should happen? And if the legislature wants to get involved, then fine. But let's remediate it first because it hasn't been remediated. That, of course, went over like a lead balloon. On the other end of the spectrum, we were told, oh, well, let's not just do the UPC development. A couple of legislators were, let's go farther. Most were, let's do the UPC development. So that's where your two polar positions were. After months and months of negotiation, we got to a point where there was a general understanding that has so far held up in 2018. We're in March. The bill was not introduced. It would have had to be introduced by the bill introduction deadline in February, so that's a good sign. And how did we get there? We got there by agreeing to two things in principle. One, there can be housing on a portion of the Baylands within a range of 18 to 2,200 units if the city and the developer agree. So it's all still to be negotiated. But instead of talking about zero, there was a range. 2, commercial development would be reasonable relative to the development costs and the remediation costs, but also just reasonable relative to the housing that might go in. That process was taken up by this council, I believe, in December. There was a discussion and there was a reference to it by the mayor. And then in January it was discussed in a little more detail, but the fine points didn't exist yet. These ranges, et cetera, didn't exist. At this point, we're now at a place where we know the range, and we have a commitment that at 18 to 2200 and at a rational level of commercial development, which is still being debated, but basically it sounds like it's anywhere from 4 million to 6 or 7 million square feet, to be determined by the negotiators, the city and the landowner, and full remediation, not what Schleglock did, not we will build and live above the ground 8 feet and our kids will not have parks, there won't be clinics, there won't be schools. It will be, they have grass they can play in, there can be parks. With those basic 3 parameters, there are others, but those are the 3 material ones. Senator Hill and others caucused, they talked, they got back to us after a week or so and said, okay, no bill. If you guys honor that, we will not push forward in Sacramento. So where the council has been advised most recently is, can we get to that range? And if so, can we put it to the voters, which we have been told from day one that this was going to go to the voters no matter what came of it, that was a commitment from the council, and the folks on the other side of the table understood it's going to the voters no matter what. So this would be the November ballot, whatever it ends up looking like. That's been the process that got us from August of last year to where we are now. I want to stress again, it has not been the city, it hasn't been 3 things. It was not Jerry Hill holding a gun to anybody's head, which I've heard. It was not the city caving in, which I've also heard. What it was, how can we get to a place where the developer and the city are talking about a range that might be workable for both sides and full remediation to the ground, which was not in the plans for the UPC development. And that's where we find ourselves today. With that, Mr. Mayor and Council, that's the background. And if you have any questions.
Council questions?
No.
Okay, we'll move on to staff report. John?
Do you want to take outside of public comment?
Okay, we can take some.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was at the town hall meeting with Mullen and Hill this evening, and one of the things that Jerry Hill had said is that he has finally realized that one size does not fit all. And if you think that there are people who are happy with the loss of local rule, you should have been at his offices today, because there is a large number of people who will come out against losing local rule. And the other thing that Jerry Hill had said is the problem that we have is that housing doesn't produce money, and that one of the things he's going to try to look at is how to bring make housing be an affordable thing for cities to do. And so those were some kind of ideas that I believe have come since these talks. Thank you.
Anybody else wanted to say something? We'll take public comment just in regards to what our council said, or do you want to do it? Okay, go ahead.
I haven't been here for your last two sessions, and I just read the recent January deliberations you had. Mr. McMorrow was talking about how people didn't understand. You have a continuing problem with that, because whenever you try to make your points about what is the Baylands, how is it contaminated, you need, I don't know who needs to do it. Maybe Dr. Lee or Dr. Lee's company, you need to be able to explain to the staff of the legislators what it is that's going on out there, and also to explain something that they should but don't know, and that is how their DTSC, Regional Water Quality Control Board, I can't speak much to the Air Board, but how they control and work these kinds of sites. OU2, which in this case includes Industrial Way, has not been, and it's agreed upon by Vic Powell, who's in charge of it for Regional Water Quality Control Board, that has not been clearly investigated to understand the nature and extent of the contamination. He's not arguing about it. He agreed at one of our meetings of the BBCAG. And so I think both to help the legislators and whoever you're going to be negotiating with to understand this, it has to be written in a way that it's easy enough to grasp. But like Mr. McMorrow mentioned, oil, well, it's mainly chlorinated volatile organic compounds that are what's going on up in Schlage and in the northern part of OU1. So OU2, it isn't well understood. There's some VOCs, and there's some other small things that I don't really know. When I say small, I mean, they always talk about it as though it's not that important, but really it's arsenic and lead that was in and some kind of a herbicide that was sprayed for decades on the rail yard. So all those things, and when a little bit of what they mean for public health needs to be communicated. And the fact that Regional Water Quality Control Board doesn't require them to clean up until you or to determine how it will be cleaned up until you give them a land use. So it's if you do this, I'll do that. But you want the information first, but they won't give it to you because you haven't made a land use. It's, I don't think, a very good system, but that is how it works. And so communication, like having someone actually who understands the contamination to be able to explain what's going on there, and then just a whole piece that you can use as an information piece, as you would if you were a lobbyist for a company, so people understand what exactly is going on. And I know that's what's been being done, but I can tell by what's been said that there isn't enough information to help people understand the risk. And when you talk about, he mentioned, where will the up to 2,200 units go? And that would certainly be my question. How on earth are you going to figure this in order to have enough space? And the last thing would be that I'm sorry, I'm probably not going to be able to say what that is, but I'll come back. But I just want to say something. It seems like, you're all doing a very good job of trying to proceed here, but if you're not going to give them more information, you're always at risk because you're not providing them with the incentive to do the right thing. Because it sounds like some of them honestly don't know, because it's difficult. Thank you.
Okay.
Do you mind if I ask a question to staff?
I'm going to actually have counsel, because, you and I had a
that was going to be
extensive discussion with Senator Hilbert.
comment.
Tom, you want to?
It would help if you weigh in. I do want to. The point is well taken. My reference to oil, and I know I paused before, it was actually a reference to a comment by a legislator that that's all there was there, because it was trains. So no mercury, no, that was the comment. It wasn't meaning that we were saying that's all there is there. We've said it's understudied and nobody knows exactly what's there.
So can you speak to what the ad hoc subcommittee, the nature of some of what we spoke with Jerry in regards to some of those topics that were mentioned?
Yeah,
I mean, I can comment on that, but you might give a better summary.
the general dynamic was that Senator Hill had I don't know the full number of meetings, but there were two very important meetings. One of them was where I'm sorry, council member, I'm so used to saying assembly member, council member Davis and Mayor Conway spoke at length and in detail about the environmental contamination, what hasn't been tested for, what has been tested for, whether or not those tests are accurate, blurring of the lines, frankly, between the landfill and OU1 and OU2, sort of using the train tracks as though they are some sort of natural barrier to contamination, and they're not, of course. Deep, passionate discussion about all of that, and that's just the remediation piece. It went from that to talking about the ridge, talking about planned infill in Brisbane, etc. So there was a extended discussion multiple times, but one in particular where the senator listened for 2-something hours silently, I think, but actually listened. He wasn't just being polite. He was sitting there listening. He followed up. At the end of the day, the response from Sacramento, as has been referenced, is, and this is not limited to Senator Hill, but he did say it that day, but it's also what we hear from pretty much everybody up there is, well, DTSC will figure that out. Now, that being said, your council members then explained, Senator, there's DTSC, Water Quality Control Board, the divisions of authority over the different parcels in some detail. So the senator has listened. He has understood. There is so much pressure to build housing because there is a housing affordability crisis, because there is a housing crisis, because when you do look from the sky, you see a large swath of land. But your council members not only acquitted themselves well, which is not what they expected me to say here, but they also went into great detail. And they did follow up on it, and the senator followed up on it, and his Capitol staff followed up on it. But nonetheless, the answers ultimately were, well, we trust the regulators. On the other hand, when Senator Hill had his discussion, where he talked at length, it was all about the housing crisis. We can remediate this. He took his givens. We can remediate it. We will address it. He was very positive about this can be solved, but then we need housing. So there was a reflection of what is going on in Sacramento versus what's going on in local communities. But it, frankly, in my view, it was very healthy because he did listen very, very carefully. He was responsive. On the other hand, with due respect, the council members heard what is going on in Sacramento and the broader picture that Sacramento is looking at for building of housing statewide and basically everywhere. So that was the dynamic. These were not polite meetings that were 20 minutes long. They went on for hours and they were rather pointed and detailed.
Can I follow up with one more thing? Tom, do you think if the legislators that are kind of involved in this effort to, put forth housing in Brisbane, do you think if they had, more information, if we continued to talk to them about these concerns that get brought up by our constituents, do you think that that would have any impact over
the situation that we're in.
So you want me to be the one to say no? No, it won't. It may lead to more remediation, may lead to more attention. In our case, it has certainly led to far more serious attention to those issues. But in a word, no. The housing crisis is so daunting and so overwhelming. That's where the focus is.
Thank you, Council. I'm Beth Grossman. So I just have a clarification question about this process because I think others may also. So as I'm understanding it, it seems that in order for this bill to be averted, we had to kind of make a compromise that we would consider 18 to 2200 houses as long as there were all of our requests were met for the houses, and we made some kind of agreement with UPC. So, did I understand that correctly?
UPC was not part of the negotiations at our request. That came up early. The city wanted to be heard by its elected officials. UPC, I'm sure, had its own meetings. It was not averting the bill. It was the broader picture of the bill was a rather scary threat at the end of 17, because even if it passed, and I want to stress this, even if it passed, it would have ended up in court. But that's millions of dollars in fighting that you all don't have as a city and you don't want to spend unnecessarily. So it was important to put it in a broader picture. You were on the right side of it, but you also didn't want to have to fight in court to show you were on the right side of it. That being said, it is Sacramento's very strong view, a majority, I would not say it's a supermajority at the moment, that localities have been the reason for the housing crisis. And we knew that more bills were coming, and we had a sense of the kind of bills that were coming. So whether or not Senator Hill's bill was introduced, our view and our advice was there will be more bills, and the bills will be about stripping local control over this piece and that piece and this piece and that piece. Those will end up in court. Those will end up tying up fights, all the rest. Do you want to be part of that debate, or do you want to be, and the council hasn't finally decided, the vote has not been called, but, or do you want to see if there's a way to avoid having to be part of that debate by dealing with this, from a distance, incredibly attractive parcel of land? I mean, I can understand the housing activist's point of view, absolutely. So the goal was to avoid being in the local control fights on the basis of a reasonable compromise of some nature and putting it to the voters. And that's what came.
Okay, so that's my next question. So let's say we've kind of tacitly agreed to this reasonable compromise, but we've also, in order to reach that compromise, we would have to change our general plan. And I think that all of you have run on that idea that if we were to change our general plan on housing, that it would go to a vote. And so my question is then, what if the voters decided that we wanted no housing? Then where does that leave us in terms of that agreement that we put on the table?
Very vulnerable in Sacramento.
At that point, you would be going from a planning commission that voted, there wasn't a single aye vote for housing, to a point, I'm correct in that, right? It was?
Right.
Okay. You'd be back in the target. You wouldn't just be one city, which is where I think you are now. You'd be back as the city we're going to have the Wall Street Journal write about and others write about as the center of attention for folks just looking out for their home prices, etc. I mean, frankly, they're ludicrous arguments, but you all lived through it. You saw the press. You saw what was being reported. You don't want to be in that position, because the way Sacramento responds is to say, oh, we took care of that. And when they do that, you have one of two things. You have a bill you can't live with, and you're spending a lot of money challenging it, or you have a situation where it may not be a bill, but you have so damaged the city's reputation that you have other issues, attracting business, keeping business, etc. So where you are now is a city that sat down and had a rational discussion and focused on a responsible outcome. And it has not been decided. The voters say no. The voters say no. It'll have to be interpreted. I will just tell you, if the voters say no and there's not some new development, it'll probably be interpreted like the Planning Commission vote.
Which would, do you think, result in another bill that then does get introduced, similar to the one that was threatened?
I don't know that at that point it would be specific to Brisbane, but certainly yes. It would be an invitation for a bill that would impact Brisbane, but probably at that point impact some other cities too. But you would all be the point of the spear that they point at.
So I just have one final comment. I just said I think that the alternative plan that was recommended by the Planning Commission is been confused with the community plan, which it seemed like when you were giving your talk, that the press picked up on this idea that we only wanted commercial development, which is it's further from the truth than it could be. And so I just think that we just need to always be really clear about what plans we're talking about.
Within the first 10 to 15 minutes, I mean, you guys were in the room. That was the very first thing Senator Hill brought up, was a Planning Commission vote, and he was disabused of that notion. Lori was mayor. Was he disabused even before the meeting?
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Beth. Glutton for punishment.
Hi, Lori Liu, former mayor of Brisbane. So yes, I was at that meeting with Senator Hill, and he brought up the Planning Commission's recommendation, and that was the signal to him of the resistance to housing. And he read the Planning Commission's view or decision or the recommendation as the view of the city and of the council, which I think was a misunderstanding. I don't think that was not the case, because the council hadn't yet even discussed it. We hadn't gone through the EIR at that point of when the Planning Commission came out with its recommendation. So, but I tend to agree that if the voters did not approve the housing, that it would be another signal to the legislature. So.
Reiterated it also on the ad hoc committee.
So the senators raised it 5 times that I know of, and 3 of them were very quickly with Mayor Conway, former Mayor Liu, and Ms. Davis, and it was shut down very quickly, but it was the first thing he raised. It really was, there was confusion, and it was addressed.
But is there anybody else that wants to? Okay, Clara, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Council. Deb Horn, Brisbane resident. So just listening to Tom's narrative, and it is a narrative because it's a perspective and a position. And it's all very fearful that this bill is going to pass against Brisbane. I think the tide is turning with SB 127, and that's the transit bill. Anything in the swath of transit, you can build 8 stories high. So I think the story about there's a big cry out there in the state that's going to become more vocal about local control, because there's overreach. this bill that we're threatened with is overreach. SB 127 is overreach. The thought that we are hostage and this bill's going to keep coming back, I think, is a perspective I don't share. Tony Atkins, I know her well from San Diego. She's an advocate for affordable housing, not for housing at whatever cost. So there's nuance to what's going on that I didn't hear in the story. So I just would like to bring that to your attention. Also, it looks like these numbers, will we talk about the numbers later so we can ask some questions? Okay. So the question I have before you is, in order to put this on the table as a possibility to vote, do you need to change the general plan first, or is changing the general plan part of putting this on the table for a vote?
Put an amendment. Okay, we're going to put an amendment on the ballot. We'd put a general plan amendment, and we'd put it on the ballot for the voters to vote on.
So the general plan stays as is until the voters vote. Okay. Fair.
Basically,
Oh.
attorney.
Thank you.
City attorney.
There's a number of ways it could happen. I think, as I understand the council's discussion in the past, it would be that the council would, for example, adopt a general plan amendment, but it would not be effective until the voters approved it. That's my understanding as to where council has indicated in the past. I'm assuming that's where the council is today, but I don't know that until the matter is actually before the council.
Yep.
I have a follow-up question to staff. Would you be able to walk us through kind of where you foresee 827 going? I think it's SB 827, right? So I know that, we've kind of discussed how obviously there are some very controversial bill. There are clearly things that need to be amended with that. Can you tell us where you foresee that bill going? Is kind of the process that we can expect in the next few years with regards to how that will morph over time.
Yeah, happily. 2 points. I just like my oil comment, and I'm sorry if I was unclear. I am not saying that the Hill bill will come back as a threat year in and year out. What I'm saying is the local control issue is going to keep coming back, and I believe it is. In terms of 827 hits at the heart of a lot of questions. Transit-oriented development makes a lot of sense environmentally. It may not make a lot of sense from a social justice perspective. Imagine living in the studio flat that's overlooking the train tracks, etc. The Sierra Club has come out in opposition to it. We expect another major name to come out in opposition to it, although that hasn't happened yet. We'll see if that happens. We think that it's essentially going to start and has started a debate about transit-oriented development and housing development, and that debate will continue for the next few years. And I imagine something will come of it, but I don't think it's going to be 827. It's going to be a heavily amended version or an entirely different concept. But I do think the notion that there's going to be incentives to build around transit is coming. I mean, we are a state that wants to protect the environment. There's a balance that isn't reflected in the current version of 827. That's not a personal opinion. I'm telling you what the Sierra Club said.
Clear.
There was discussion of the fact that the compromise that's been suggested that says 1,800 to 2,200 and requires a residential level of contamination be achieved. You kind of can't say that, because you may not be able to do that. Or maybe you can if you spend $15 or $16 million doing it. It's like, I would say that one of the things you might want to consider is to require from your side that the state hold Brisbane harmless for liability resulting from injury and death due to long-term exposure in those residential units. Why not? They're telling you that you can only have a 400 unit range of what you can do. So if they are so insistent how are they going to control DTSC? Are they going to ask them to overcome the laws protecting the environment and the public in order to achieve this residential level of decontamination? It's only a level of how much you allow to remain. But they probably couldn't have ever met it for Schlage. That was why they didn't try to, because of the amount under there. But it's perhaps the state might not be so eager if they have the liability. Thank you.
That's a legal question.
You can certainly ask, but I think that that it would be a bit of a long shot to think that the state would agree to do that in some sort of legislation. But certainly as part of the process, it can certainly be one of the things that we could bring up with our representative. I just wouldn't want to hold out a likelihood of that occurring without a lot of other things having to be conceded.
I guess the first part of the question is if it cannot be achieved, that level that we're requesting.
Scientifically, I can't tell you one way or the other. I know it's incredibly expensive by anybody's standards. But as you know, that was out there from day one, and it was ultimately accepted as part of a compromise, if there is to be one, that would go before the voters, if there is to be one.
Okay. Any other questions in regards to council's report on how we got here today? Because we still do have a staff report on top of that. Sir, I don't think you were here for council's. Okay.
I could actually go after.
You have a question about what's on the staff report? Do you have a question about what's on the staff report or council's report?
All I've seen was the news clipping.
Pardon me?
All I saw was the news clipping, but I have some technology things.
Okay, we could take that later on then. Okay, and you could, did you put a slip in?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, staff report. John, I think, is that you or Stuart?
Yes. At the January meeting, the City Council requested the staff look at what the impact of 1,000 and 2,200 homes would be, as well as a range of 2 million to 6 million square feet of commercial space, what the impact of that would be on the city's finances. We went to our financial consultant, KMA, to work through that. Debbie Kearns is here to give a presentation on the report that was been produced. So I'll turn it over to Debbie at this point.
Okay. Hi, Debbie.
Well, good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. I'm Debbie Kern, as Stuart indicated, with Kaiser Marson Associates. And the last time I was here was about a year ago, talking about the developer-sponsored plan and the Planning Commission's plan. So today we're here to talk about these, as we're now calling them, the compromise development programs, hypothetical programs that we've been asked to analyze. The purpose of the evaluation is to see whether or not that these programs have the potential of meeting the city's requirement that all new development pay for itself. And what that means when we say the word pay for itself, it means that a project will generate sufficient tax revenues to fund the costs of municipal services to serve the project. So it's ongoing tax revenues relative to ongoing municipal services. And we're asked to look at potential measures to ensure that any project would generate a fiscal surplus to the city, or how you can really protect yourself financially from the impacts of development.
Can I make one clarification?
Sure.
This is a study on the city's fiscal health, not on the project's viability, correct?
That is correct. That is a good distinction. This is on municipal revenues and expenses, and it is not an assessment of the financial feasibility, the profits, or the viability of the project from a private development perspective. And in fact, that's something I want to talk about. It's a major assumption of going forward with analyzing this. But let me see. This is not the, okay.
Sorry, I interrupted.
Well, that's not the presentation.
I'm sorry, this is the old
From
one.
last one, last time.
That's from last year, that presentation that's loaded on there. Is okay, well then, unless you can load the one from that was emailed to you?
Can we take a 5-minute break while she gets this
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
squared away?
Cool.
Absolutely.
5-minute break time.
All right, let's reconvene the meeting. And now, are we ready? The right staff report?
Right slideshow here. So, all right, let me see. So what we were saying is that we wanted to make sure that these programs, that they met the city's policy requirement that they pay for themselves, that they'll generate sufficient tax revenue to cover municipal service costs, and then also to identify measures that the city can take in going forward to make sure that any project generates a fiscal surplus to the city. The hypothetical programs are identified here, and as you can see, they range in residential unit count from 1,000 to 2,200. And the staff identified these programs, and the units are supposed to be comprised of 90% apartments and 10% townhomes, and that's a major assumption. So you have 90% rental units and 10% ownership units. And then on the commercial side, it's between 2 million and 6 million square feet of commercial. Now, these are, this large project relative to the city of Brisbane, but it is significantly less than what the developer-sponsored plan was. The findings of the analysis are driven by assumptions that we have in the analysis. And so these are hypothetical programs, and so there's lots of assumptions that have been made, and they drive the findings. And one is, it speaks to Councilmember O'Connell's comment about financial feasibility. We have assumed in this analysis that this program is financially feasible, that it would be built. And we have not tested that. And as we've just had the conversation about the challenges with this land, with the remediation, there's on top of that, there's lots of infrastructure needs. There's topography. It's very expensive to build on this land. And so we have not tested whether or not that this development program would generate sufficient revenues that a developer would actually even, ever build this program. That's unknown. The other key assumptions, as I mentioned, about that 90% of the units will be rental apartments, and the reason why that's important is ownership units are generally priced higher than apartments, have a higher assessed value, which translates into more revenues to the city. So if you have everything with apartments, program with apartments, the revenues are less than it would be if it was a more balanced program. Another assumption is that it has been assumed that all of the new streets would be publicly owned and maintained by the general fund, and that adds a lot of costs to the city. Historically, on the property, there have been rock crushing and soil operations, and historically they generated about $810,000 of city revenue. And of course, if this property is redeveloped, none of those operations would be viable on the property. The last is the average household size, and this was consistent with the draft environmental impact report of average household size of 2.23, and that's consistent with the average household size in Brisbane today. And if you had small apartments, it's likely that the population would be less than that. But with those caveats, these are a summary of the findings of the analysis for these 4 different alternatives. As you can see here, it is estimated that alternatives 3 and 4, which are the higher unit count ones and the larger commercial programs, would generate a surplus per year ranging from about $700,000 to $1.4 million a year. Alternative 1 is projected to generate a deficit, and alternative 2 at $218,000, I would say that's just really a wash. It's sort of neutral. And so that's what we're showing as the impacts of those different alternatives. Regarding the composition of revenues, and property taxes are by far the largest single source of revenue that would be generated by these alternatives at over 60%. And then the next largest component of revenues would be sales tax. And the combination of those two is over 80% of the revenues would be from those two sources. So property tax is the driver of revenues. On a service cost basis, the largest component of service costs are for fire and emergency medical. And then the next largest component would be police service costs. And the third would be public works, and that's the maintenance of the streets. The police costs have been estimated based upon an extrapolation of what the requirements were going to be for the developer-sponsored plan. The city asked us to also look at what would be the impacts for each land use component. So it's taking those alternatives and breaking those down by what are the tax revenues with residential compared to the service costs for residential, tax revenues of commercial versus service costs, and for each land use component. And as you can see here, it is estimated that the residential component in each alternative would generate a deficit to the city each year. And that the deficit amounts to approximately I haven't calculated that, let me see. Approximately $670 per unit per year is the deficit on average. And the other components would generate a positive. And this is consistent with the conventional wisdom and it's true that you have, we don't even have hotels here, but non-residential space generates more tax revenues than the cost of providing municipal services, because when you have just employees there, they don't, for example, usually use recreational classes, and it just costs less to serve commercial properties than it does residential properties. Retail generates sales tax. Industrial space can generate a lot of use tax revenues too. So commercial space generally generates more revenues than residential, because residential, the only component of revenues is property tax revenues, really. Now, the causes for the deficit are driven in some ways by the parameters of the analysis, our assumptions. Again, when we assume that 90% of the units are rental apartments, then we have, by design, limited the amount of tax revenue that would be generated by the residential component. We have assumed that 100% of the city service costs are funded by the general fund, and that residents wouldn't carry any of that cost. In many new developments, residents pay for a portion of costs through assessment districts or through a CFD, or you privatize streets and you have homeowners association paying for it. So in this analysis, we have not assumed that at all. We've also allocated or credited all of the sales tax revenues as if the retail is generating that, because it is. That's where the sales taxes would come from. But what supports that, what generates those revenues, are in part the expenditures by residents. So, if you had a broader analysis, you could allocate a portion of that to the residential and give the residential a credit for some of those sales tax revenues instead of allocating it all to the retail space. We did a sensitivity analysis and said, well, what could you do if you made different assumptions with the residential pencil? And it would, if you did something like you had a 50-50 split of rental units and ownership units instead of all of 90-10. If you had that the streets were all maintained by the residents through a CFD or an assessment district. And if there were fewer residents in each unit, which would be comparable to smaller units of a condo, then that it would generate, at least it would generate a positive in many of these scenarios, if not in some cases a push. But that's just to show that the assumptions are important, and the analyses are very sensitive to those assumptions. But conversely, there are some costs on the project that have not been included in the analysis. For example, if you have parks, we don't have any maintenance costs for the parks programmed into the city service costs. And so those obviously have to be maintained too, but they were not part of this scenario. So there are some components that I would say are higher than they should be, and then there's some other things that are missing, some service costs. So, but I think in general, that if there are ways to structure it so that residential does pay for itself is I think the takeaway, and that cities can make sure that if development is to occur, that it will pay for itself. You do have tools that you can employ to make sure that that happens. We were also asked to do a break-even analysis. So since the residential doesn't pay for itself, the question was, how much commercial do we need to have in order for the projects to be revenue neutral to the city? And in the findings of the analysis were that for the 1,800 unit project, that you would need 3.7 million square feet of non-residential space. For a 2,000 unit project, you need 3.4 million, and for a 2,200 unit project, you need 3.6. The findings are a little bit counterintuitive, and the reason for that is you would think that the 2,200 unit project would need the largest amount of commercial space because it has the most residential units, and that the 1,800 unit project would need the least amount of commercial because it has the smallest number. But it's because of the composition that we've assumed in the commercial is very important, in that retail generates a higher surplus than light industrial does. Light industrial doesn't generate much because it doesn't generate much tax revenue. It's just not a high value development. It does generate a lot of service costs, but it doesn't add a lot of value. So in this scenario, the 2,000 unit one generates the highest, really, because it has the largest amount of retail square footage per unit and the least amount of light industrial. So it just shows that it's important. The mix of development is important when you're trying to achieve fiscal surplus. In terms of mechanisms to enhance the fiscal impacts, this is really what we talked about last year, and it's just reiterating it. One is just optimizing the development program, the mix of land uses, and to make sure that they will yield naturally a fiscal surplus to the city. Another is to see where you can shed some of the costs from the city's general fund and privatize those costs. Now, the downside of that is it makes housing very expensive. And so any of these mechanisms, when we say that, well, the homeowners can pay for maintaining the streets, the homeowners can maintain the parks, the homeowners can even have a CFD where they fund part of the police costs or fire department costs. And that's what other communities are being forced to do in order to make things pencil. So, but there is a cost to that. And what that is to the homeowners, their tax bill is very high. Whereas when you buy a home, your property tax, your base levy is 1% of the value, and then there are some school bonds on there. And so typically the all-in rate is about 1.2. So it's 1.2% of the purchase price of your home. When you start loading on the costs of assessment districts to fund all of these services that you need, that percentage can go all the way up to 2%. And so it's very expensive for homeowners. You have to have expensive homes to have high land, high values for high property taxes, and then on top of that, they have a very high tax bill. So it doesn't work towards providing affordable housing if you want to make things pencil from a city's perspective. Another is to adopt some new taxes, construction taxes. There has been different cities have construction taxes, and that is a tax on the cost of building, and that can generate a lot of revenue. In some cities, it does. You can require the metering, which we didn't have in here, but it's really of requiring that the commercial space be built first, or be built in tandem with the residential, so residential doesn't lead. And then you can require a fiscal analysis be done prior to each phase of development to demonstrate that as you go forward on a cumulative basis, that you're always in a fiscal surplus position and that you're not in a deficit. Because what can often, if you don't have these requirements in a development agreement, the developer is going to build what makes the most profit to him initially, and that's often the residential. And then you can be behind, and then the city is in a deficit position because what matters to the city is not in alignment with what is best for the developer. So it's important that if you want, a development agreement, that it protects you and you make fiscally. Another is to capturing business-to-business tax revenue, and that's the use tax revenue, and that's important from both from construction-related revenues to make sure that Brisbane would be the point of sale for capturing use tax revenue, and then also ongoing of making sure that the businesses that are on the property, that they are ones that actually generate use tax revenue. That's another thing that can be in the development agreement, that they have to have, these certain types of tenants that generate use tax revenue, that the office tenants generated, not just retail sales, but office tenants generate use tax revenue. So you would have to, it takes a lot of time and effort, but there are tools that you can employ to increase the amount of tax revenue that would be generated by the project. And that concludes my presentation, and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. A council question for Debbie? Anybody?
I have just one clarification.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the type of levies that could be or special assessment districts that could bring the taxes up to perhaps 2% wouldn't be including any of the initial horizontal costs of infrastructure also.
No, this would be
After the build-out.
Yes, it would be, and this is typically how it's done, in that it's a way of creating revenue often developers will want to put a Melrose on the property to cover construction costs for infrastructure. So that would be one component. And then if cities would then also add on, it's called a Melrose for services. It's a CFD special service tax. And that would be on top of it. And so you have then these multiple layers. You have your base 1% property tax levy. You have school bonds and other service district bonds costs. And then you would likely have on this project a CFD for infrastructure for those horizontal costs. And then the city would then have another CFD on there for services. So it's all these layers that's how you get up to that 2%. And then if there's a homeowners association, those HOA dues are on top of that and are not even part of it. They're beyond the 2%. And so that's where you get the ongoing costs. You have your mortgage, but on top of that, you have a huge tax bill, and then you have a large HOA bill. And then with the new tax structure where those are not even, they're not tax deductible from the federal obligation, it's very expensive. It'll be very expensive for homeowners.
And then the other question I had was on your did you consider the closure of the Golden State lumber? I saw that you reduced the income for the soil and rock crushing operations, but did you consider the sales tax from the closure of Golden State lumber?
That was not assumed to be. It was our assumption that would be relocated
within the project. Yes, or within the
yes.
city. Okay, thank you.
So Kinder Morgan, Golden State lumber, recology is a separate issue, and those would remain the same, basically.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Madison, you have any questions?
No, I don't have any questions.
Clarification, Cliff?
Yeah, I do. Thank you for the presentation. During your presentation, it talks about build out, but before build out, there could be cost to the city, and I know in one of the number 7, it talks about developer payments. are you aware of cities that during the negotiations of the development agreement, the developer provides a certain amount of money that offset costs that the city would have until build out occurs?
Yes, that's another provision that is possible, and we have worked on those, and where it was actually, there's a case down in it was for Hollywood Park down in there in Los Angeles in Inglewood, and that's to build the football stadium for the Rams. That there was a casino on that property, and the city was getting about $1.7 million a year out of that casino operation, and so that was going to be going away, and it was a big amount of money, just like you have here. And in that case, the developer's responsible for paying out of his pocket the 1.7 until the revenues and other tax revenues were there to offset that.
Okay, so that's not an uncommon thing.
No, I mean, well, it's not. It happens. Yes, I mean, it's not something that people want to do, but it has. It does occur.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. I have a number of slips here for public comment. Pardon me? Okay, we could do it in public comment. Yeah. Okay. First up, I have James Christie.
Hi, Council. First off, thank you for all the work you've been doing talking to our elected officials, and I really, really appreciate it. And Tom, thank you for all the work you've been doing on behalf of our city. I think the agreement that you came up with the legislators is very reasonable, and I know it's not a formal agreement, and I would very much encourage the council to bring this to the voters in November. I think having 1,800 to 2,200 housing units on the Baylands is very reasonable. I've talked to many of my neighbors, including those who choose not to come to council meetings, and they've shared with me that they are fine with residential development happening on the property, particularly if it's about us maintaining local control. Another part of the importance of maintaining local control is I want this property to really reflect what Brisbane is. We came up with a wonderful process during the Parkside Precise Plan, where we had a series of workshops where the city worked together, where many residents came together to envision what the Parkside would look like. And I would very much hope that the council would also encourage similar workshops so that we feel as a community that we own the Baylands and we own what ultimately ends up there. And again, thank you very much for all the work that you're doing on this.
Thank you, James. Mia Christie.
Good evening. Mia Christie, resident of Brisbane. I've heard, from a lot of people at these meetings, the concerns about the future of the Baylands, and so it sounds like where we're at is we may have to, move forward with a compromise. It sounds like that's very much the direction we're going in, and so I'm concerned that if we don't start looking at it like how can we own what the future is, like how can we actually shape what's going to be there so that we're not stuck with something that we regret. So because I know that everyone's concerned about a lot of people are concerned about the environmental impacts. Well, everyone seems to be concerned about that, but it's not just about like housing or no housing. It's like, will we be happy with the result, and will we get the most benefit from this land if we are just refusing to move forward? So I'm just curious, like, what we can do, and I've heard that we have the option to do something like the Parkside Plan, so if we could have a workshop or some way that the whole community could be involved and really own what results. I think that would be best, because I just would want collectively to be happy with the result, like we have been with other projects, like the library, for example, when we planned that out. So that's all I want to say. I just want it a win-win for everyone in the community.
Thank you, Mia. Mark Roast. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Close, but not quite. It's Roost, like Shirikanu,
Okay.
or Mark Roost. I live in San Mateo. And I got interested when I saw the first article about the biotech companies not wanting to have her take the land at all because they wanted to leave it for themselves to be able to move out into when and if they got ready to expand. And at that point, I realized that using something like a Futrex monobeam bidirectional monorail group rapid transit could collect people from the different centers that could be developed in the Baylands and bring them both to the Caltrain depot and across Daly City across Brisbane to the BART station as well. So, and that could be very inexpensive relative to other relative things like BART or a variety of other things. That's one piece. One of the reasons it can be inexpensive is that there is new construction technology and materials that's available. Actually, a structural system that was invented in the late 60s that I was involved with for 10 years called the captive column and ultra-high performance cement or ultra-high performance concrete, which is available and it's vastly outperforms ordinary. So putting those things together, you can have long clear spans, low cost structures, small foundations, and using lightweight coaches. And I know the guy who built the quarter scale models for the Futrex. He has tooling to build full size coaches sitting in a warehouse ready to go. And then the cost of setting him up could be diluted by having several projects in the Bay Area going on simultaneously. I've identified at least 60, 70 miles of projects that need to be done. And so the ultra-high performance cement is basically a modern adaptation of the Roman cement that was used to make the Pantheon, which has been in place for 2,000 years, and the aqueducts that have been in place for 2,000 years. And it also was used to make wharves in the Roman Empire. Pouring underwater, So this stuff doesn't hold. It doesn't sustain mold or mildew or bacteria. It doesn't. There's a lot of things that it makes a nice, high quality building, which will last for a long time, and it can be 3D printed or sprayed. So the cost, you could build a house in 3 days. I'm looking at a way that the entire project cost could be driven down, and you could have the transportation, and you could also mitigate remediation of the environmental things. And this could, if you want structures to be lifted above things, I don't know how you're going to meet. I didn't know any of the details about the environmental impacts, the environmental toxins that are there. I just saw what was published tonight, but if there's technology that's needed structurally to that, we got that to help too.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Clara Johnson.
Thank you. I was able to say what I need to say. Thank you.
Okay. Dana Dilworth.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. I didn't know we're in a compromise mode, so I'm just a little floored right now. But during this whole process, we were told that things were going to be studied equally. And I don't hear any mention whatsoever about income from solar and or any recognition that the community renewable energy plan could be very viable, especially if we were to develop a municipal utility district and charge for transmission line fees. So there are a lot of things that are missing. Like, what about the hotel tax? If we put 8 hotels out there instead of 3, that could be a big difference. What about the water wheeling agreement, where the people on the Baylands are going to be paying higher water costs than anybody else in the Bay Area? And I'm curious about Dr. Lee's contract of where is there, I happily heard you guys say that you would request that we would be indemnified from any litigation for any errors that we make, and then, oh, well, if we're not going to get that. So let's put that into the mix of discussing the cost of this. And I just kind of want you to be aware that if we approve an environmental impact report for 4,400 units, we will get 4,400 units, because when you question something, they will say, we already studied it. And that's what happened at Chalet Glock. They came in with a bigger proposal, they accepted smaller, and before they cut ground, they came in and asked for the higher densities and the higher figure. So you may say that you're approving something less, but unless you have an EIR that is specific to that, you're approving 4,400 units. I just would hope that you understand that and that we're not playing games. Thank you.
Dana, Barbara Ebel.
Hi, Barbara Ebel, Brisbane resident. It appears we've come to the point as a society where we no longer care. There is nowhere we will not build. We have no standards left. 2.5 million gallons of jet fuel, radiation, liquefaction, sea level rise, VOCs, heavy metals, leachate, carcinogens. And that's just the tip of the icebergs, according to the experts. There is no place to contaminate it anymore. I don't truly believe people would want to live there if they were fully informed. However, this path is not a solution, but a road paved in gold. $444,000 to lobbyists, $10,000 to Mr. Mullen, and likely another $500,000 on media campaigns. As my community is on the auction block, I ask myself, how can we salvage our humanity? So I played a little math, because that's how I like to frame my solutions, based around numbers and facts, provided to me, in this case, by these experts here tonight. And I looked at they had this weird thing where they did the employment population was a percentage of the residential population, and I think that's because they were looking at it in terms of services. I looked at it in terms of a jobs housing balance. And so I used the population densities from the DEIR. Their services, their businesses, they calculate out at about 0.002 employees per square foot. And so for alternative number one, I came up with 2,000 employees, 8,000, basically 4,500 and 5,500, and almost 7,000. I got looking wrong row. 4,000, 7,000, 10,000, and 12,000 employees for each of the various scenarios. And then I divided that over the number of housing units we're going to provide under each scenario. And so alternative number one would provide 45% of its housing needs. Alternative two, 36% of its own housing needs. Alternative three, 32% of its housing needs. And alternative four, 33% of its housing needs. So, and if all of these scenarios worsen our housing jobs impact, not make it better. So I want to know how we as a city are going to be both financially responsible and responsible to the Bay Area at large, like everybody's screaming at us to do, and not make the jobs housing balance worse. Thank you very much.
Deb Horan.
Sorry.
It's okay. It's blowing on me too.
Okay.
Deb Horn, Brisbane resident. So, well, there's so much worry that I see in your faces. So much worry in this room. I think you all deserve a raise.
Like where you going?
Because I know you all care, and thank you again for your service. I'm just going to pass a few of my worries on to you, so you can have a little more when you're deliberating about all of this. I just have some questions, and if you think it's worth pursuing, I wish you would, so I won't worry. So one of them is about the build-out. We talked about having a developer agreement, so we do the commercial first. So one of my worries is UPC is an entitlement company. We changed land use. They can sell it. They cannot do the development. It can be sold in parcels. Things can happen out of our control. I'm worried about it. So maybe you could just let me know if maybe I shouldn't worry about that as part of the conversations that go forward. The other thing is I do think finally the press is taking a little turn. Cities are getting a little more involved because of some of the state overreach. There is a shift to affordable housing, not just housing at whatever cost, or not just supply and demand. I think there's some analysis like it's got to be affordable. And I think the legislation coming forward is going to be more in that direction. So one of my worries about passing on these costs to the people that live there is it's not going to be affordable, as we heard from the analysis. So there will be mandates for affordable housing, and I think that's something we need to make sure that we can do. I guess one of the options was just taxing all Brisbane residents more. That wasn't brought up. It wouldn't be very popular. Terry just got her worried about that. I'm not suggesting you do it. It's just the numbers don't really pencil out because housing is so expensive for cities. Then I have one more worry. And that is about I read the analysis, and so the assumptions and some of the missing pieces, like Dana talked about some things that weren't brought up. What about the water? What about perhaps utility scale? Solar, questions about just all of the things that were brought up as issues and assumptions in the analysis when we're looking at scenarios and we're playing with numbers. Like, how do we make this number work that Jerry Hill likes? How much commercial and how do we make it work? So service costs that are missing shouldn't be missing. We should nail that. And Parks and Rec open space costs, we should nail that. So then there's also the long term, because these are costs per year per house. What about long term liability of the risks? What's the cost to that? I hear we don't want to go bankrupt in a court case with the state, but we also don't want to go bankrupt with liability that is in perpetuity about what we do on this land. And then the other thing I just wanted to suggest, Barbara brought it up, it's a good idea, to do some analysis on the numbers of jobs to housing ratio. And it's not going to be more housing than jobs. It just doesn't pencil out. But there was a great debate with San Francisco mayors candidates last night, and they were talking about this big development south of Market. And there, it was acceptable that they had a 5-to-1 jobs to housing ratio in their development. This is a city that's causing our problems of the housing shortage. So anyway, maybe with the financial analysis, we could do a little bit, we can get our finance people to talk about jobs to housing ratios, because I think that's important in the conversation. Anyway, I'm sorry if I went over, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Deb. Michelle Salmon.
Michelle Salmon, Brisbane resident. I wish I had that few of worries over this. My list is long. I can't even go into it all right here. The question I have on the study for the services, the part where it said, public works, etc. Were those just standard services for a standard residential and commercial development, or did it take into account this the challenging circumstances of this particular site where it is almost 100% landfill? Matter of fact, the only part that isn't landfill is a very, very narrow part right along Old Bay Shore. The rest of it is landfill, as shown by old maps and photographs. So in landfill, especially unregulated landfill, there's a lot of this going on, as we all know when we drive over Tunnel Road. And what lies beneath is the various services and sewer lines and water lines and everything else that are going to be constantly needing repair because of settling of the land. So I'm wondering, did that take into account the amount of public works it's going to require to maintain services, streets included in that type of situation? Because there will be settling. There will be continued to be settling. It's settled a lot in the last 20 years, and it's not done. So I hope you ask that question. And then I really want to make a point that the whole thing is landfill. And I would like there to be deed restrictions in perpetuity for any housing entitlements, if we go that route, that it covers all of these conditions about reasonable costs, full remediation in particular, because that is home to 3 former Superfund sites. And the only reason that they're not Superfund sites is because the property owner agreed to remediate the sites when they acquired the property, and that is why they were removed from the Superfund site list. And so I want to make sure that all 3 Superfund sites, one of which isn't even mentioned in the draft EIR, which would be Stauffer Chemicals, are remediated. We don't really even know what's out there. Last week I listened to Vanessa Garcia talk about 7 Mile House and the guys that came in there, and where we went to the California Historical Society, and she said, well, what happened to the rail engines and trains that they couldn't fix and stuff? She goes, oh, one of the guys told me, and she was talking with a guy who used to work at the rail yard, because a lot of those guys hung out at the 7 Mile House. So it was one of the kind of history interviews. And he said, oh, we just buried it. We just buried the rail car if we couldn't fix it. Really? So what else is under there? You really have to ask what else is under there. And we really don't know. And it is so unbelievably irresponsible of our state legislature to bully us who are trying to do the right thing about these environmental toxins in this situation with this extremely dangerous piece of land, bully us into building housing so they can, look bright and shiny for all the housing advocates. And I'm sorry, it just makes me really sick. And so that UPC can get their housing entitlements, which raises the property value. So when high-speed rail comes along and takes it through eminent domain, the taxpayers, you and me, are going to be paying 10 times more for that property than if it's empty, contaminated land, if it's approved for housing. And that's where the real money is. And I feel like we are being taken advantage of. I feel like the state legislature is just rolling over for all these developers and shill companies like San Francisco, Housing Action Coalition, which is just a nonprofit shill for a bunch of developers. They only want to build new housing in San Francisco. They don't want to take care of any of the problems with the housing that already exists there. And so I'm kind of sick of it. And I think you guys should stand up a little more to them about it and make it really a lockdown deal if you're going to do a deal. And make sure it covers all of the problems that we are going to suffer with this. Thank you.
Michelle Beth Grossman.
Thank you. Exactly a year ago, I reached out to a large group of community members and asked them what their burning questions were about the Baylands development and housing. And many of you may remember that I wrote them all on a big, long white scroll and rolled them down the middle to come up here and present them and to read them. And I presented them on May 11, 2017, which is almost a year. And I feel that we still have these unanswered questions, which in Deb's words were worries, and same with Michelle's. But these are real, serious questions that need to be answered before any kinds of decisions or compromises or anything can be considered in terms of housing and passing the EIR. So there were 50 of the questions. I submitted them, and I just kind of summarized some of them down to 10 just for the purposes of tonight, because they're all important. Many of them were mentioned in various ways by Michelle and by Deb. So what are the actual plans for remediations of the toxins? Is it truly safe for housing? Would we be willing to raise our children on that land? And who's going to pay for the remediation? Is there going to truly be affordable housing? What are the plans for size and price? What income levels will be able to afford them? I've seen Lennar advertisements on the BART listing Bayview affordable housing starting at $600,000 for a 600 square foot plus HOA. And I went further to go out to look at India Basin and posed as a prospective buyer and all of the units were well over $1 million. And the interesting part, I really urge you all to go out and have a look. The interesting part about it was that there were many, many units that were laying empty in the initial buildings because they can't sell them. Okay, and they are now at a discount. So have a look, go ask, find out the real truth about all of these affordable houses. And they're like a little island that they've declared that little part of India Basin is safe because that's where the officers' houses were, but it's completely surrounded by the rest of Candlestick Hunters Point Toxic, which happens to, by the way, have the highest cancer rate in their police force of anywhere in the Bay Area. What is the economic benefit for Brisbane if we have to maintain the roads, police, fire, school, and public works, which is, you did ask for that, but we only asked for that for the housing plan. Where is the economic evaluation of the alternative plan that was recommended by the Planning Commission? What is the liability for the city of Brisbane for future health problems or effects of earthquakes or sea level rise on the development? And what were the results of the reviews done by Dr. Lee? Are they made public? What was considered? I never really got to find out what happened there. How does the high-speed rail fit into this picture? And I think Michelle laid out that picture very well, as have I at previous council meetings. Where is the water going to come from? Still has to be seriously determined. How are we going to deal with the traffic and the impact of all this development on our ability to get in and out of Brisbane? And what are the mass transportation facilities? How are we going to deal with the noise from the endless pile driving that will go on for year after year? And then what about the noise levels in excess of 65 dBA from Bayshore Boulevard, Caltrain, and Highway 101 that'll affect future residents. What about the tank farm? We need to figure about this, whether we have housing or anything. Is there an evacuation plan in the event of an earthquake or fire? What is the dirt that's being recycled piled higher on a daily basis? Where is it coming from? Where is it going? Is there a soil manifest available? Has it been tested by an independent company? How is the Baylands development being coordinated with all the Candlestick, Hunters Point, India Basin, Bayview, and San Francisco development just north of Recology? So anyways, those are just some of the questions. I really feel that, to quote my husband who always says, we have to solve the right problem. Right now, I think we've completely let ourselves be consumed with this fear of these bills and by this bullying by our legislature. And these are the questions that we need to put back to them. Because I really feel that we are, as a city and as a group of citizens, are trying to do the right thing by our city and for the people who, the future residents that are going to want to raise their families in a safe and clean environment. Thank you.
Can you submit your comments to Ingrid?
Yes.
So we have them on the record. Thank you. Okay.
Corey Smith.
Good evening, council members. Corey Smith on behalf of the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition. Third county I've advocated for housing for today, which is, I think, kind of shows where our heads are at with a lot of this stuff. A couple of things related specifically to the economic feasibility study that was done. I'm not by any means super whiz with numbers, but looking at the different proposals based on number of units, my gut says that a 4,400 unit proposal would end up in more net revenue for the city than the other ones, just basically looking at those trends. I don't know what those numbers would have been, but I would have been curious about that. Number two, regarding 827, I totally agree. This is a conversation about local decision-making versus state decision-making and who should have that power to determine land use policies. And I think it's a debate, I agree, that's going to continue probably for the next few years. By my understanding, and we're obviously very close to the bill, does three essential things: raises minimum height limits to 8 stories around transit, it eliminates parking minimums, and eliminates density decontrols. The last thing that I think is really interesting, we've started this thing called YIMBY Moment, Yes in My Backyard Moment, and it's basically people using that hashtag talking about when they realized housing was a big deal and when they decided to get involved to start advocating for more homes for people. So if anybody is on the Twitter, it's just interesting to read, and you can see a lot of personal stories there. Thank you.
Paul Buscal.
Paul Buscal, Brisbane resident. Thank you, council and staff and community members. So I guess it's been going on for almost 30 years. And, you know, it may seem like there's just a few members from the community that are always at meetings. And in some ways that's unfortunate. But there have been a lot of people that have been contributing to this effort, whether it's been on the commissions, the committees, community members, members in particular on the draft environmental impact report that I sat on. And I'm just going to reiterate things that I've talked about in the past. And one of the things that's really important to remember is that mitigated measures will be done when feasible. And the traffic circulation is a big deal if the interchange in a 101 isn't done. That should be a condition for any development, that interchange is put in. The cleanup and not just remediation is what was supposed to be done when they purchased the property. So I've mentioned, Mr. Zola mentioned the risk that this community is at when we have to haul away cleanup through other communities to its final destination. And I proposed that a lot of the dirt that's on the landfill side that's going to be brought over some of that dirt brought over to the OU1, OU2 parcels, that they do a conveyor belt and they dig down to the top of the unregulated landfill, wherever the engineers decide it's a safe spot to do it, and they just conveyor all that contaminant on the OU1, OU2 parcels over to the unregulated landfill. I'm sure that would reduce the cost, the thousands of truck trips that it would take through other communities that put them at risk, as well as this community at risk, because we are liable for that contaminant for its entirety. So, mitigating measures will be done when feasible. That's the wording in every chapter. We have to be careful with that. Some of the other wording that's being used is, we know that 25% of the baylands is to be set aside for open space and open areas. Well, the wording says that that will be open space and or open areas. And we know that open space just means public property and open area means private property. So, early on, it was my understanding that 25% of that would be open space and open area. Well, that's changed to and or open area. So we have to be careful with that. One of the other things that's important is, the infrastructure cost for residential is going to be enormous for this community. And we won't talk even 2,200 homes. We're talking about, tripling our population. It's not a small town feel. This is a small town. And we have small town concerns and we have small town rights. We want to live in a small town. With that said, high-speed rail, which wasn't any part of this discussion in the draft environmental impact report, that in itself is something that the state needs to address. And it's my understanding from somebody that I know that it was originally 100 acres that the state is talking about needing, and now it's 200 acres that they want. Okay? That's a big deal. Where do they want to put it? It sounds like we really don't have a choice in the matter. It'd be nice if we could say, this is where you're going to put it. I'd like to tell them where they could put it. Okay? But my point is that, we need to know, where is this 200 acres going to be? Regarding the housing issue, it's a big deal. Okay? Affordable housing doesn't mean affordable for the average income couple or persons. Okay? So we need to make it known as to what it is, and none of those kids are going to be in our school district, yet they're paying property taxes that are going to go to the Bayshore School District. Okay? I mean, what percentage of our property taxes goes towards the schools? Is it like a quarter of our property taxes goes to the schools? Something like that. Okay? It's going to go to the Bayshore School District. That's not Brisbane. That's Daly City. Okay? A long time ago, when we talked about land use in the Baylands, I proposed two things, and one of them has to do with Daly City. When Supervisor Jane Kim and Mr. Peskin and others said that they were going to take the land eminent domain, only the county or the state could do that. Okay, so why don't we allow Daly City to build the housing in the Baylands, be responsible for the cleanup with UPC, and in return, on the Cow Palace site, the state could have a new event center, because we talked about drawing people to the Baylands and having something that was substantial to really say that, look, this is what we have. We put an event center like the Cow Palace in the Baylands, along with the high-speed rail properties with the state, and the state allows Daly City to build UPC's housing up on the Cow Palace site. It's clean. They talked about putting in a new transit system down Geneva. So, if we're going to start getting creative and have to come up with the issue for housing in particular, let's keep it in the county. Let Daly City build. Daly City could supply the water. They have supplemental water within their system, okay? I'm sure that would work. One of the other things I just wanted to throw out there again, and I talked to Will Travis at the time, who was the director of the BCDC, and I talked about widening the channel on Visitation Creek and creating floating structures in and amongst the bioswales. And the reason why I'm bringing up floating structures again, because it's my understanding that down in the Silicon Valley, they're talking about doing this. And here's why it would be important. Hundreds of millions of dollars are coming in to the San Francisco Bay to do wetland restoration on old industrial sites, mainly salt production, okay? So what we could do is near the channel, we could carve out this whole area, i.e. clean it up, with the knowing that we're going to recreate wetlands that used to be there. We could get money to recreate wetlands and build floating structures that would be sea level rise adaptable, like this gentleman talked about, the special concretes. They'd be sea level rise adaptable, they'd be earthquake proof, therefore you wouldn't have to build structures to earthquake standards, and they would be able to ride out the earthquakes and liquefaction. We could build our critical infrastructure floating. We could build parks on top of a sewage tank that's our sewage system that's floating the tank. We could do a lot of things on the Baylands if we get creative, and I think now is the time. But I really do think that we need to get high-speed rail in here and talk about, what are their intentions. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Barbara, are you again? Is this from you? Okay.
Would it be appropriate, I know you have a little bit of insight into that from your, I know you have some insight into their timeline, which isn't really
What's your question?
promising, that
About
Terry,
about high-speed rail.
yeah, I think that would be
I
helpful
don't
to the public.
have a lot of insight on high-speed rail except for the local policymaker group that I've been attending. They did not express to me any increase in size. They are talking about doing an EIR that gives equal attention to both sides of the Caltrain tracks. And I believe that their intention was to have the EIR for that completed by December of 2019.
So we won't really get a good, we won't really get a good understanding of where they're trying to go until probably sometime around then.
That would be my intention, or my information that I have. I don't have anything else that has been made definitive.
Okay, Barbara, is it?
I thought I'd break up my comments into two parts tonight to try and give you guys all a rest. So a couple things bothered me about the financials. There was a lot of kerfuffle about how the consultant had relied on UPC's numbers for their last report. I didn't see them taking a different approach this time. The public was dissatisfied with that, and then they did that again. I'm not sure where else they could have gotten it, but it seemed like some things should have been done a little more independently. The emission of open space and the associated costs, because open space does not maintain itself. Open space can be pretty damn expensive to maintain. And I'm pretty sure, as I read it, they took no account for that. And since the Baylands is supposed to be 25% open space, that can be pretty substantial. I also noticed that the hotels were missing, the solar was missing. I guess they're just presuming that everything will be zero net energy because that will be on the books by 2030 anyway. But I'm concerned that those costs were not accounted for, figured into things in general. And I think the last thing I wanted to talk to you is I wanted to share a little bit about my experience, personal. I haven't really gone personal up here before. I moved to San Francisco on the Green Tortoise bus with my boyfriend when I was 18. We rented a room which I think was originally designed to be a pantry off the kitchen. It was about 8 by 10. We shared that room. After that, I got a different place. I was paying 75% of my income in rent. I had a different boyfriend later who had a basement apartment. The ceiling was really low, so we did the whole ceiling in fairy lights. I thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. I wanted to move in with him just for his apartment. I don't think the Bay Area has ever been easy. I mean, I was here in the housing boom in the 90s when all of my artist friends were fleeing to artist lofts in Oakland because nobody could afford to live in the city anymore. It's happening again. And in between that time, we had the bust, where everybody knew was losing their jobs and losing their homes, not because they couldn't afford their jobs due to lack of income. It's never been easy here, but I think, I'm sorry to be all doom and gloom tonight, but I'm also really concerned what we're going to be leaving the millennials, not in terms of a housing crisis, but in terms of an eroded democracy. And to me, that is the bigger problem, because housing will come and go, we'll dice it up, we'll make more, we'll move to the suburbs, we'll have kids, our kids will move back into the cities, and they'll fight it out all over again. But I'm really concerned when justice, social justice, and democracy are the things that we say, we don't care anymore, just give us housing. And I think that is, and just the, cancer. Cancer. It's a cancer of the mind, and it's a cancer of the body. And I say these words because I want to fortify you, because I know your fight is horrible. You're having a horrible fight. And please continue. Just be strong. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Lori Lou.
Thank you. Good evening again. Lori Liu, Brisbane resident, and as you know, I was mayor last year when this came to the council. And, I think we all in the room now understand that this threat is real from Sacramento. And as was explained by Tom, if the city doesn't approve housing, I think the risk of losing local control is really significant. And as he mentioned, if this council approves housing and then the voters don't approve it in November or whenever it goes to the ballot, then that puts us in even greater danger and of having, the developer's proposal forced upon us. And if that were the case, then, as has been talked about, we would have none of these environmental controls that we would request. We would have no negotiating power to ask for any community benefits. So that would, put us in the worst position. So, I trust that you as the council are leading us in the right direction. I thank you for your service and your patience in this process. And in looking at the staff report, I would recommend that you approve of a housing allocation that provides net revenue to the city. And according to the staff report, that would be a minimum of 1,800 to the range of 2,200 units. And if it doesn't provide net revenue to the city, then it's not worth it. But we also, I would encourage you to ensure that it's economically viable for the developer, because, while it's not the city's responsibility to ensure that economic viability, it just doesn't make practical sense to approve of a development that can't get built. And thirdly, I would suggest that you look at the services that would be provided and ensure that whatever level of residential is approved, that it's enough to support local retail in the area. There was an email that was sent to us this evening. I got a copy of it along with the council by Adina Levin from Friends of Caltrain. I encourage you to take a look at that again. She cited some other cities such as Menlo Park and Mountain View that in their recent developments, they made sure that that whatever they approved would provide local services, local retail services. Because right now, we can't get a grocery store, we can't get a pharmacy, we just don't have the number of residents here to support that. And I hope that if you did approve housing at the Baylands, that I hope that the residents there would be able to, walk down the street to a grocery store or to the pharmacy. And, that really does affect their quality of life, to be able to walk to things. We have some retail here, we have some restaurants, but, for most shopping, we have to go outside of town. And for it to be truly transit-oriented development, I would like to see walkability to those retail services. So Tom mentioned one phrase that caught my ear. He said that, what you're hoping to do is strike some sort of responsible compromise. And I think that's key, that the city really needs to look to be responsible to our residents by having a development that is safe, and also being responsible to the developer to approving a development that can be built. And then thirdly, most importantly, to be responsible to the larger Bay Area community, to show that we are playing a role in helping alleviate this housing crisis, which is regional and does include us. The consultant from Kaiser Marsden mentioned the mechanisms that we can use to enhance our fiscal benefits. And I would encourage you to work with the consultant and look at what we can do to generate use tax, and whether we should require the developer build commercial in tandem or prior to residential. These are things that we can only do if we're moving forward in creating a development, that is a win-win situation. If we're fighting it, then we're never going to get those economic advantages for the city. So I trust in you, the City Council, that you will work hard on all of our behalf to find a responsible compromise. And by moving forward, I know that you are not ignoring all of these environmental concerns, all these health hazards that we all care very deeply about and want to make sure that the development is safe. But in fact, that you would be doing your best to ensure that the property does get cleaned up and it is made safe, and that it is a responsible compromise. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Lori. That's all the slips that I have. Is anybody who has not spoken wish to speak? Okay, Dana.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. There were people mentioned Caltrains, and I have seen some documents that are about the two locations. I've seen some maps, and the one that would put the light rail on the, let's say, west side actually has totally taking down Ice House Hill. So they would be widening through that area to straighten it out. The other plan that I saw that goes to the east side, or the landfill unregulated dump, that it doesn't cut through Icehouse Hill. So I don't know who's involved in paying attention, but they are not taking Icehouse Hill as an important environmental feature. The other thing is that when I heard that you're working with people, the legislators, and you only speak of things that are in the soil, you have, at least I didn't hear it this evening, that you have forgotten about the volatile organic compounds. And one of the most revealing images I saw was presented by Barbara Ebel, which showed the methane that continuously off-gases off of that property. And so when you're talking to the legislators, ask them, because I've asked several times, how close to a toxic burner should we put our housing? We have 2 out there right now, and Recology, if you read it, kind of says, oh, to get to 0, we're going to have to burn garbage out there too. So we have 2 presently, and 3rd, 4th, or 5th in the works. So just have the legislators tell us, how far away from a tank farm? How far away do you need to be? Because when I was reading about the tank farms that were blasting in Midland, Texas, they needed a full mile radius away from the tank farm. So just tell me, where do you want to put this housing? Okay, I know there's a rail, but there's also a lot of volatile components out there. We've got toxic burners that there is no mention of. What do we do? What are you going to do? But we'll go out and build housing. Oh, and only 100 of them now will be purchasable. So to me, that's like, I don't know. It's the plan I see here is not making any sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Roost again, San Mateo. Somebody said require Brisbane be held harmless. I would add and require the builder to certify completion of cleanup. Let them deal with it since they own it. The core city power in law is to protect the health and safety of the citizens. You should be willing to fight on that one. And to require full remediation to health standards, which means whatever the cost is, it doesn't matter. But then on the other side, by using some of these technologies that I'm looking at, the developer can cut the cost, and the people who are building infrastructure can cut the cost. And also the maintenance. The Port of Rotterdam is paved with ultra-high performance concrete. They use about 1/5 as much as they would if it was just ordinary concrete. The company that I know about, their latest lab test was 192,000 psi, where ordinary concrete is 5,000 psi, and high-strength concrete is 6,000 psi, and ordinary ultra-high performance cement is 23 to 25,000 psi. So there is an opportunity, there's a design opportunity for what Bucky called comprehensive design science to actually make this thing work for everybody. The floating idea that he came up with, I've been trying to figure out how to articulate that before he said it, but that was perfect. I'm also into structures that can be used to make floating structures more affordable in combination with that ultra high performance cement. And the tax, and instead of taxing the residents and the low income residents, those taxes somebody mentioned that could be a problem. Tax the commercial for their part, but tax especially more than commercial, tax the biotech and R&D office to cover the low-income housing residents' share of the taxing that you would need to make your stuff work. And our company also has battery and solar, so we can help with that solar all the solar you need. We can put it on the elevated guideway. Instead of doing light rail and tearing up a hill, you can elevate your group rapid transit, and it'll be a lot cheaper, and it'll also leave a lot less unobstructed use of the space underneath.
Okay. All right. Michelle, before you get up, or you can come up, but I entertain a motion. It's 10:31 right now, and
I'll make a motion till 11, but I think that we need to get it wrapped up.
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay.
Michelle Salmon. I just want to go back to the entitlement issue. If you look at sort of UPC's track record, I mean, they're entitled already to build 1,500 units at Executive Park, and they have been since May of 2010, and they haven't done a damn thing about it, and I think that what they're looking for is housing entitlements to increase their property value so they can dump it and move on. And that's my personal opinion, based on their track record and based on even what they have on their websites about, their companies managing entitlements, not housing projects, but entitlements. And I feel like the public is being extremely taken advantage of here with us increasing their property value and then the public having to pay that. And it really distresses me, and I think I have a problem with that, and I'm not sure that the state legislatures really stopped to think about how that affects overall the public. It's just like, the public's going to pay, billions of dollars for high-speed rail, or the high-speed rail is going to, pay just compensation for that property. And what is just compensation for, toxic landfill is quite a bit different than just compensation for an area that has been entitled to build housing. And we saw what entitlement, invested tentative rights, did up at the Northeast Ridge, and how there was no going back on that, no matter what the truth of the situation is, no matter what the damage to the environment would be. There was no going back on the fact that we had given them vested tentative rights to build housing. And so they did. And it didn't matter how much we stood up here and told the truth about it. And we're going to be in the same situation again once we give them entitlements. And so tread carefully going forward, because I'm sorry, it's the public is going to have to pay for that, and be it the public now and the public in the future. And we talk about the cycle of life, but we're coming to the end of the cycle of life for our species if we don't do something different than we're doing now. And that means, renewable energy. That doesn't mean continuing to build on toxic land and continuing to increase the population. And I'm really distressed when I looked at that report, what Barbara brought up about the difference, and we're creating more problem with housing to job ratio with the commercial development that we're willing to build out there, and the lack of housing in combination with it. I don't think we should be building commercial development out there either. I don't think people should be on that land. It's really bad, toxic land. So it's not Brisbane wants to build 12 million square feet of commercial and no housing. It's not that kind of a debate at all. And it shouldn't even be a debate about Brisbane wants to build 2,200 units of housing and 3 or 4 million square feet of commercial space. It really should be about what we need to do to ensure a better future overall for the entire region, and not about individual housing, but about our energy crisis and our environmental crisis that we're facing. Thank you.
Michelle. Anybody else? Anything that hasn't been said yet? Okay, it's not a public hearing, so just a couple comments is I know a lot of people brought up a lot of things here, and it's like, I truly understand how toxic it is, and everybody up here understands how toxic it is. Our staff understands how toxic it is. But you also heard from our consultant, the state legislature. Madison and I spent 2 hours, and with VOCs, I explained it in very, very minutiae detail about it with my experience working with them in Silicon Valley. Their response was that we will rely on our regulatory agencies. period. And that's it. And so, it's an interesting position that we're in right now. And hear all these things, is like, I get it. Totally get where you're coming from. The whole council does. And this is not a great position to be in, but we also understand what we're faced with. It's just a one-way conversation on this one, Dana. It's not I'm not, I get it. I totally get it. But we're going to have to move forward, and that's really what it comes down to. And much as people don't like it, we know what we're going to get. If we say now, then we know where we're going to get. Comes to the ballot when all the details come out, or when we put a general plan amendment on, and if people decide to vote it down, we know what we're going to get. And that's just the reality. Things have changed. If we had approved something 5 years ago, we wouldn't be in this position. But the landscape has changed, the legislators have changed, and the only word I could use is the state is now housing anal. That's it. We don't care. Housing. Back in 99, 2000, it was business, need office, and then a glut hit. All of a sudden, a lot of buildings stood vacant. Who knows what's going to happen in the next cycle, but that's the way it is. That's the reality right now. And it's unfortunate. And the best 4-letter word I have for it, I call it 5 letters, it sucks. But that's the truth. And so right now, as a council, we know that we probably got to move forward here. And that's it. So I'm going to bring it back to council and maybe ask staff, what do you need from us tonight? What do you need?
We're looking for direction from the council as to what to prepare for a November ballot.
Okay. Council.
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah.
Can I just say a little something first?
Absolutely.
Great. I think it's great hearing from the public and acknowledging the issues we know are with this property. Everybody brought up a lot of good things. Most of it will need to be addressed at the specific plan level when a project actually gets proposed and when the safeguards are put in on how it's built, what it's built. Some of the things are for the developer, for what kind of materials they're going to use, how they're going to structure their infrastructure costs to be reasonable for future homeowners and businesses. A lot of those things are things we can't determine right now, and we tried to use the information that was presented to us with worst case scenarios for financing and liabilities. And I understand all the concerns. We know that it's toxic land out there, and we know that if we're the ones on the forefront, that we can actually make a difference and set some of the levels that we want and the performance standards that we need to be viable as a city and be viable as a environmentally conscious community. So with that, I would recommend that we look at the 18 to 2,200 units and up to 4 million square feet to be somewhat in that responsible level. And I'd like to see where the rest of the council feels.
That to look at a general plan amendment?
No, just I think to recommend it to staff to bring it back to us. And one of the things that I would really want to make sure is that we add, staff brings us back some draft performance standards and companion policies that are going to guarantee fiscal analysis along the way and phasing where we can make a general plan that has some built-in safeguards as far as cleanup levels and fiscal issues for the city, not necessarily fiscal issues for the developer, because that's shouldn't be our concern. So that would be my recommendation to send back to staff.
If we can have some clarification.
I think in order to put together something that would go on to a ballot in November, I think it would take the form of a general plan amendment. We would certainly draft that and include within that the kinds of things that Councilmember O'Connell is talking about, plus whatever other concerns or issues you might want to see in a general plan amendment. But I think the appropriate form to cover the 18 to 2,200 units and the 4 million or so square feet of commercial would be in the form of a general plan amendment, so that the council would have something to consider, and then if it were adopted, then that could be presented to the community for a vote.
Is it possible that we can also designate in what area that these units would be taking place and give direction to staff? Because I think as a council, we've sort of talked about OU1, north of the proposed Geneva extension, as the place that we would be considering housing if remediated to residential standards.
And John can jump in on this, but the general plan amendment would take into consideration land use, land density, and it could also indicate a locational aspect of those uses. Is that right, John?
Yes, that's correct. That's at the discretion of the council. You can provide as, limited direction or as specific as you would like to get.
I'm done.
Is that a motion?
Is it a needed to be a motion, or are we giving direction?
Well, I don't know it has to be a motion, as long as the council consensus is that's a direction that you want the staff to follow. I think we just want to make sure that we have clear direction on the matter.
Karen,
I agree with Terry, and I want to say to the public, people who are here and people who are not here who might look at this later, every single person on this city council is 100% aware of everything that's going on out at the Baylands. And if new things come up, I'm sure we'll look at them as well. But everybody here cares very, very much about the safety of everybody moving forward. We are very well educated on this situation. I was on the first BBCAG. I know what's out there. I know what we're up against. But I'm going with Terry on this.
Cliff?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to thank people who spoke up today, who've spoken up in the past. A lot of the things that were said today, I'm in agreement with you. When I ran for office, people would ask me, do you support housing or not? And I'd tell them, it's not a matter of support or not supporting, but how are you going to deal with it? And that local control is the most important thing that we need to maintain. As Councilmember O'Connell has pointed out, no one's going to remediate that site or have that oversight like we would. You just look at what's happening in San Francisco. Look at the massive development that's happening at Oyster Point. We need to control how that development is done. I'm glad that people talked about getting together and doing, having community involvement, having community say. We really need to have that. Now's the time for us to come together, roll up our sleeves, put aside those differences, and really address things like affordable housing, having a zero carbon development, being smart with our transportation infrastructure. and I'm looking forward to doing that with all of you. One of the things that I'm going to point out is in the economic analysis, and it says the findings of this analysis should be viewed as providing a starting point for exploring a range of potential mechanisms to implement that will ensure that the public infrastructure is adequately maintained. And that, to me, that goes beyond, the streets and, lanes and, like bike lanes. And, it's also about how we make sure that how we monitor the contamination in perpetuity is maintained. The future residents receive quality municipal services. People that live out on the Baylands, potentially, they're going to be our citizens. They're going to be us, and we want to make sure that we're providing for them and that development doesn't take away from us, and that the project generates net fiscal surplus for the city of Brisbane. That goes without saying. We've got to make sure that happens. So I'm in favor of looking at that range of housing between 1,800 and 2,200 and up to the 4 million square feet of commercial space to be as a general plan amendment for the voters.
Madison?
This is so hard. Obviously, we're in a situation that's less than ideal. But I want to reiterate how much the council has worked to educate our legislators. I feel that there have been a number of things that we have taught them that they didn't know about the site prior to meeting with us. Specifically, Clark and I spent extensive time having a lot of these hard conversations. And I wish you all could have been flies on the wall. It would have been a lot of flies. But if you could have been flies on the wall for that conversation, you would know. At some points, I was close to tears and feeling kind of backed up in a corner and, concerned that we still don't really know everything that's out there. But it's become clear that a lot of that is not factoring in to where our legislators are coming from. And it's disappointing. But as Tom mentioned earlier, the housing crisis is intense, it's real, and unfortunately it's becoming it's overpowering a lot of the arguments that we're making. And it's a stronger motivator than a lot of the safety concerns that we've described. And our legislators have full confidence in our regulatory agencies, as I expect they would. We all have, different experiences maybe on a more local level. But at the end of the day, there comes a time where you have to make a strategic choice that you think is best long-term for your community, and that is the position that we're in. And to me, I hate it. I don't like it. And I lose sleep over this at night. And I feel so frustrated because, I was very clear when I ran how I felt about housing out there. And my concerns that, I'll be around to see those impacts. But what I'm not willing to do is I'm not willing to bankrupt our city for a fight that I don't think that we're going to win. And that's where we're at. That will impact our quality of life here in Brisbane, and that will impact the services that we have, that we all cherish, that make Brisbane special, that make Brisbane a place that we love to call home. If it was a fight that I thought that we could win, money is money. Sometimes it's worth it. But if it's a fight that you think that you will lose and you will spend so much fighting it, at the end of the day, you still want to have your community intact for us, what we enjoy here. And to me, that's so important. You know, I want to maintain what we love in the Brisbane that we have now. And so for me, moving forward in this is important. And it's going to take a community to come together and work on this as a team. And I know you all don't like it, and I don't either. You know, I'm not over here joyous about the situation that we're in. But at this time, because the pressures from outside of Brisbane are so strong, I want to see us come out of this as a strong family. And you know, there've been quotes. There's a quote in City Hall when you walk in, and it says something like, you know, we quarrel as neighbors, but when somebody pokes at us, we all band together like a big extended family. And I think that's the time that we need to do this. That time is now. And so we need to come together and make sure that whatever does go out there, all of our concerns are addressed. And that's first and foremost most important. And I'd hate to see our community be at war with one another over something like this. So that is my encouragement to the community. My door is always open. I want to have these conversations with you. Sometimes 5 minutes is not enough to express what's on your mind. And so I want you to feel free to call me, to email me, and we're going to work on this together. So with that sentiment, while I don't like it, you know, I think this is the smartest move for Brisbane at this time, and I would like to see staff come back with numbers, you know, with looking at 1,800 to 2,200 units in OU1. So I support, you know, the sentiment here from the rest of my council members.
Mr. Mayor, I think we would like a motion. I think that would be better for clarity's sake.
Okay. So Terry, I think you were pretty clear on what you were requesting, and is that?
And I seconded that.
Okay. So you have a motion and a second. Any further discussion?
I just want to make sure that we know that there's safeguards that are going to be written into this, and that it is not a blanket declaration at this point, but that it's more of a direction to staff to bring back something that we can make sure addresses our concerns and our community's concerns and the safety concerns and the fiscal concerns.
Okay. Motion and a second. It's on the floor.
So I noticed, Terry, that you said that you were asking for a study of up to 4 million square feet of commercial.
Yes.
And I just was curious as to why that amount, because alternatives 3 and 4 look at 5 million and 6 million square feet of commercial. So at first I thought you were looking at alternatives 3 and 4, but now it looks like you're mixing.
I'm doing a mix of it, and part of the reason is that there was an interactive display that we were given access to, that we could place commercial and we could place residential and sort of play with building blocks. Okay. And looking at that and looking what we've got, that I felt that was a reasonable number. And so there is always room. You don't want to negotiate the start at the highest you can do, but you know, that's where I felt comfortable, and so that's where I went.
Thank you. I didn't know there was that background, but yeah, I was just curious because as you go up within the commercial, then the net revenue to the city grows. So if you're able to talk about the commercial aspect, I'd be interested in hearing how you came up with that number.
Sure, at a future date. I'm sure
At a future date. Yeah, I mean, it's all speculative, and I think a lot of this will come out when it's into the specific plan.
Okay. Motion's on the floor. Any further discussion?
Nope.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Next item, Mayor Council matters, City Council schedule concerning the Baylands deliberations. Staff report, staff.
In terms of this particular issue, you've given direction to us tonight. Let us take that back, and then we'll get back to you in terms of future calendar.
Okay. All right, very good. Written communication, I had done Michael Barnes on 320, David Crabb on 320, Bill Detmer 315, Brisbane 411 on 35 and 228, Sean Horan on 27, and Jess T on 21. Okay, with that, I think we're adjourned.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.